All right, perfect. So I'm Ann Ellefson. I'm the Director of Academic Support here in the Department of Public Instruction. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to be here with us today. We are here to talk about equitable services and those equitable services that pertain to ESSER funding. That is the CARES Act funding that districts received, school districts in North Dakota received in, we'll just say, spring of 2020. I am going to go ahead and share my screen and my slide deck right now. You should have all received this slide deck in today's updated meeting invite. It is available. There we go. It will also be made available afterwards. If there's something that you would like out of this to replicate at your own district, feel free to contact me and we'll get that sent out to you. As I mentioned, this Teams meeting is recorded for our archival purposes to track questions and answers so we can publish those, and then also to make it available because not everybody is able to attend, but we really appreciate you all taking time to be here today. Real quickly, our agenda. We are going to review why are we here in the first place, what timeline events happened, what occurred, what brought us here to today, those next steps regarding equitable services, and fielding a question and answer. So let's back up a little bit. In March 2020, our world's kind of hit a new thing that we've probably never ever lived through in this pandemic. So in March, the COVID national emergency was declared and financial funding in the CARES Act was passed. Now, within CARES Act, it's important for you to note that there were a couple pots of money that go to schools and districts. One is called ESSER and one is called GEAR. ESSER is implemented here through the Department of Public Instruction, so our office. GEAR is implemented through the governor's office. So just so you're aware of that. In April, the USDE issued some guidance on what equitable services means, in particular with those two pots of funding out of the CARES Act. There was a little bit of back and forth regarding that guidance and the U.S. Department of Ed interpretation, and the USDE had released a IFR, or interim final rule. We'll go into more information on what that means. But that was in July, and then in August, there were quite a few lawsuits, and the preliminary injunction orders were issued as well, which then brought us to September 2020, where there were some court orders, and in particular, on September 25th, 2020, the U.S. Department of Education sent a memo to states regarding what we needed to implement as next steps. So in the last 2 weeks, we've been getting this content and this information ready to you to send out to districts and non-public schools in North Dakota, which really leads us to where we are today. I do want you to know with this timeline of events, this is where we are at today. There are still court cases that are out there across the nation. This isn't just a North Dakota thing. This is the thing that's happening all across the US. And there's still court cases that are pending. Might they alter what I share today? Maybe. We're not certain. We don't know. What we're doing is we're proceeding with what we know, what we have today, and we will update you as we learn more. There's also this little thing that's called an election that is also happening. So when I say that little thing called an election, it's not only the presidential election, but both for the House and for the Senate, there's election things that might change this. You know, could Congress take more action and address this issue? Possibly. Like, quite honestly, if you would have told me back in March that the courts were making decisions that were going to impact our equitable services, I couldn't have predicted it. So we appreciate you being here with us today, and we will share with you what we know. So I'm taking that timeline and kind of breaking it down into a little bit more detail. So as I mentioned, in March, there was a CARES Act funding. That applies, there's two of those grants. One is the ESSER, which is Elementary and Secondary School Education Relief Fund, and one is the GEAR Fund. Now, we specifically are talking about ESSER funds today. But it's important for you to know that the GEAR funds, first of all, that application was just released yesterday, and public districts are welcome to apply for that. And if a district receives those funds, these equitable services also apply to that funding pot. So just so you know, both of those funding pots are pertain to the ESSA, to the equitable services. It's also important to know what was stated in the CARES Act statute. In the CARES Act law, it said services must be provided to students and teachers in non-public schools in the same manner as provided under Section 1117. In other words, Title I. So Title I rules and regulations need to determine how we provide those students and teachers services in non-public schools. Those consultation requirements must be in place, and the funds must remain in control of the local public school district or the LEA. So those are just key pieces that I'd like you to keep in the back of your mind as we walk through more of this timeline. So in April, the U.S. Department of Ed released guidance, and their guidance said, well, the pandemic doesn't discriminate. The pandemic doesn't just go to those Title I students or impact Title I families. Therefore, states should allocate their funding based off of the proportional share of non-public school enrollees versus public school enrollees in the entire community, and that those services can be offered to any of those non-public school students and teachers based on that all student proportional share. And that is the information that DPI used to generate our equitable share allocation. So that's what we used when we said, here is the amount of services that your public district needs to provide to a particular non-public school. Now, not necessarily in North Dakota, but in many other places in the nation, there was significant pushback. There was pushback from states and from national advocates. One thing that's really important to know is that in North Dakota, we have a nice size of non-public schools, but it is in nowhere the same level of competition in the numbers as other states. In some states, the number of non-public schools and charters might equal or surpass the number of public school districts. So in those states, implementing based off of this formula, that the all student formula, was extremely devastating to those public school districts. And that's where I believe much of the pushback came from. Well, the USDE heard that pushback and they stood firm and they said, well, coronavirus doesn't discriminate. These funds need to be distributed equally. And they developed something that was called the IFR. Well, I've worked with the department now for 15 years. For those of you who've been around long enough to know this, I'd never experienced what an IFR or interim final rule meant. What it means is that they took their guidance and they wrote it to this IFR, which would make it law. So it took that April guidance and they took that allocation element and they made it law. Therefore, DPI felt really comfortable with our allocation method because in the guidance, one of the ways that we developed our allocations was reiterated in the IFR. So we felt very comfortable. Well, this was a huge, I would say, line in the sand for the U.S. Department of Ed and in particular schools and districts across the nation. And a lot of lawsuits occurred, and 4 major lawsuits and 1 summary judgment in particular happened in July and August that led us to where we are today. So what was decided off of those court hearings and the court order, those final judgments, are that the USDE guidance and that IFR, so the stuff that was released in June, July, and August, all of that was canceled. It went, and the USDE issued a memo acknowledging this, and we received that on September 25th that said, We acknowledge the IFR, we acknowledge the guidance, and that these have been canceled essentially by the court systems. So that really allowed or had us at the State Department having to say, okay, we need to go back to the drawing board, because as you can see with this comparison chart, on the left-hand side is how allocations will be calculated based off the guidance and the IFR. And on the right-hand side, it's what it says in the CARES Act statute. And so the information that is on the left-hand side of the chart, it became null and void. So as of September 25th, we had to go back, and instead of calculating our allocations based off of the all student language, we had to go based off of a Title I methodology, which means we look at low income kids or free and reduced lunch kids in participating non-public schools divided by the low income kids in participating Title I schools. So though, in other words, how many of the non-public school students have free and reduced lunch kids that live in Title I neighborhoods? That is who generated the allocation. Now, all districts and all non-publics are eligible to raise their hand and say, yes, I'd like to receive these funds, but only those that have free and reduced lunch students living in Title I neighborhoods and would attend a Title I public school program would be generating your money. So the right-hand side, which is what is in statute for the CARES Act in Section 1117, that was the premise and what's led us to where we're at today. I am going to shift real quick to the letter from Secretary Devos. This is posted on our website. You'll find our website under the this information under the CARES Act funding and COVID. You go to our COVID page and then you go to ESSER. Hopefully you all can see this and maybe give me a little wave or a shout out if you can. Go to non-public school and then the September 25th memo. This is what was shared from the U.S. Department of Education. The U.S. Department of Education still communicated that they do not believe that CARES Act or that COVID discriminates. They believe that CARES dollars should be made available to all, but they are going to recognize and move forward with the court's decision on canceling that guidance and the IFR. So this is something that I'll actually pull back up a little bit later, but I wanted to bring it to your attention where it is if you're interested in reading it. So with that, we ran new allocations, and every district, public district that has non-public schools as well as non-public school contacts, to the best of our ability with the email addresses we had, we sent this information out to those contacts. You'll see on the screen, and it was attached to the invite today, the list of districts, those participating non-public schools, and the old method of calculation versus the new Title I formula method. And there are significant swings in the funds that are generated. I recognize those significant swings, and we will be talking about some Q&A in a little bit to help us navigate what do we do next. In addition, every single public district received correspondence on individualized calculation worksheets. They were sent to you in the form of a PDF. What I will say is, if your non-public school does receive, or your public school does receive a GEARS application, allocation, and grant, we'll gladly share with you the Excel template that we use to calculate that equitable share, so you can use that yourself to calculate your GEARS funding. You could just reach out to me and we'll get that to you. All of this information has been updated to reflect this final new Title I method. on our CARES Act ESSER website. Okay, so I'm looking at the chat. I'm not seeing questions coming in right now. Some of you may be saying, okay, I heard a bit of this in the national news. I wasn't sure how it's impacting us here in North Dakota. Others may be saying, what the heck, Ann? Like, I had no idea about this. So I want to say, if you have questions, please chat those in the chat box. We do have some canned questions that we've already been answering, so we'll share those, and we'll have a live session too for you to unmute yourself and ask questions. So as far as next steps go, here is what we highly recommend for next steps. Number one, you need to review the ESSER Equitable Share low-income data on those Title I attendance areas. In particular, that was that secondary worksheet that I sent to all contacts. Look at that data. Verify that that data is accurate from the public school district and non-public school. Keep in mind, it is 2019-2020 data. So it is not data that is reflective of your new enrollees or new students in this 2021 school year. The other critical part is consultation. In much of the guidance that we receive, they say consult, consult, consult. So the public school district and the non-public school need to sit down and have a conversation. We need to acknowledge the judge's ruling. We need to acknowledge the IFR and that those are null and void. And we have now the Title I formulas that we need to adjust our allocations to. All of that consultation needs to be documented. If it's in the form of email communication back and forth, that's a form of documentation. If you sit down and have a meeting and people sign the agenda, that is a form of consultation. If there's a telephone log and you jot down the telephone conversations, that is consultation. It is important that you maintain records for consultation, and not only just for your own sanity in navigating this, but it's critically important, especially if we talk about reimbursement and processes moving forward. The other thing, number three, we need to adjust the service delivery plan according to the new formula. So if we went from receiving $10,000 to equitable services to zero, we need to talk about that. If we went from $50,000 to 10, we need to adjust that plan because we'll continue to receive services, but it's going to look different. Keep in mind, number four, non-public schools that have no low-income students residing in Title I attendance areas cannot get equitable services under this new formula. So if your allocation is zero now, there's no longer the avenue for equitable services. Lastly, public districts are highly encouraged to submit their ESSER, I'm sorry, too many acronyms that sound the same, their ESSER request for funds or claim in the grant management system. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that right now. So in order to request funds, the ESSER request for funds or claim needs to be submitted in the grant management system. That's where districts are receiving CARES Act or ESSER payments. LEAs or the district has to submit a ledger that has its own district budget separate than the non-public equitable share. If you want, you can go ahead and submit the non-public expenses on their own and just claim that at that time. Now, one thing that is important to note, guidance that we have been provided and a clause that I'm going to show you in the USDE memo, it says expenses or services incurred between March 13th and September 25th can be claimed using the old allocation. So March 13th was the onset of the pandemic through September 25th, which is when the U.S. Department of Ed notified North Dakota, expenses or services that were provided during that time could be claimed using that old allocation. Any expenses occurring after September 25th need to follow the new formula. So I am going to pull up the USDE memo again. So it's important to note in this USDE memo, the U.S. Department of Ed says the department will not take any action against states or local districts that followed the guidance or IFR prior to notice of the court's decision. So what that means is prior to, and we've taken it, not the court's decision, but prior to notifying us on the 25th of September, the U.S. Department of Ed will not be penalizing districts or states if we use the old allocation methods. But anything occurring after September 25th, we are accountable for. Now, what does that mean with auditors? Your guess is as good as mine. The USDE isn't going to hold us accountable, but will auditors? You know, I can't answer that today. Sorry, I'm getting screwed up here. Okay. Implementation guidance. So I'm seeing some questions come in here, and I will look them over and answer them as soon as I finish up this little bit. So services and devices delivered on or prior to September 25th are to remain in place, so there's no interruption in equitable services. Now that's implied if your district maintained eligibility for those equitable services. So you move from 50,000 to 10,000. Back orders for devices, materials, and supplies should be provided up to the newly calculated proportional share amounts. The remaining devices, materials, and supplies could be covered through ESSER funding, but then remain with the district. So a scenario here, let's say that we had $50,000 and we're buying equipment, but now my new allocation is $10,000 for non-public services. Well, that non-public school can receive $10,000 worth of that equipment purchase, and the remaining $40,000 the district could try to cancel or could use within its public school district boundaries if that back order device, if you can't cancel it. Keep in mind, private schools with no low-income students residing in Title I attendance areas are not eligible to receive equitable services. So before I go into monitoring, I'm going to look at some of the chat items that are in here. So question about, we have equitable services based on the old allocation. If everything's been provided, what do we do? I'll be answering that in the Q&A. If quotes were received and approved by the public school and completed, but the invoice received from the vendor was after the September 25th date, who's required to pay for it? It's a great question. And again, I think that question in particular is going to be critical on the consultation documentation and those services that were in place. And so we can talk through that probably more on a one-on-one basis. If a non-public school does not get ESSER funds under the new formula, and if the public school gets a GEAR grant, then is it safe to assume that the non-public school would still get $0 off of the GEAR grant? That assumption is correct. The same formula will be used for ESSER services as well as GEAR equitable services. So if you didn't have any free and reduced lunch students under ESSA living in Title I neighborhoods, you're not going to have any free and reduced lunch students in Title I neighborhoods for GEAR. Lori Olson, your question about the starting and the timeline, does it start now? Does it start in the past? The new allocation will starts now. It started as of September 25th, 26th, we'll say. But there are some processes that we can go through to determine expenses that were incurred prior. Robin Baker, I see your question about the services. If we've already provided the allocated amount under the old formula, what do we do? We'll go through that in our Q&A as well. Sarah is asking, so does it mean that non-public equitable services that happened prior to September 25th do not need to be repaid? I think repayment of services is a great question. What I read from the U.S. Department of Ed is that they're not taking action. But I would say if consultation does not exist, if documentation does not exist, or if there are illegal purchases or uses of funds, both the public district and the non-public, I mean, there's a risk for repayment and auditing exceptions. So without knowing more to that question, I think we all run that risk with federal funds if all our I's are not dotted and T's are not crossed. So if a quote or invoice was submitted prior to September 25th, are we okay? We have one that we haven't paid yet. So it depends. If it's an invoice and something's on order, we'll go through that, but the district should do everything that it can to cancel that order. If it's something that has already been consumed, let's say it was masks for the non-public school, and then that would be a different scenario. If it's a quote, an estimate, we would need to work on canceling that. Will the public school district be notifying the non-public schools if they're receiving gear funding? I'm uncertain of the public requirements for notifying, but I would definitely encourage you to have a conversation with your public school district, as well as watch the governor's website, as he will be announcing those gear funding recipients. Okay, back to the fun slide deck. So I think it's important for everyone to know that we will be monitoring these requirements in 2020, 2021. I'm sorry, 2020-21 school year. It will probably occur in 2021. So we'll be doing desk audits for these ESSER equitable service provisions. In particular, you need to keep in mind those Title I requirements that pertain and apply them to your ESSER implementation. We'll be releasing a checklist. We have a checklist ready to or drafted, but it will be released in mid-November. And as I mentioned, it's aligned to Title I consultation requirements. So it's important that you document, consult. Okay, I'm going to go through some general questions that we've provided and some of the answers that either through clarification with other webinars with other states or legal firms where we've ended today. In fact, CCSSO, which is the Council of State School Officers, they're having a webinar like right now as we speak on this issue. So thankfully my colleague Stephanie Tucrow is over there listening. We debated, should we postpone our North Dakota update, but it really didn't seem fair to have us all wait longer. So we're sharing with you what we know, and we will continue to be transparent as things progress. So what does it mean for already expended services or expended funds or services, things that have already been provided? So we've had a few questions about this. We used the old formula and we already spent the money and provided those services. So for funds that are already obligated and spent before the rule and the date in September 25th, they're considered properly expended. So anything that occurred from March 13th through September 25th, that's the window that we can use that old formula. But once the state was notified, which means September 25th, we have an obligation to make adjustments and provide revised allocations. So I did go through with a visual on how the non-public equitable share is calculated. And here's some things to keep in mind. So again, it follows section 1117, otherwise known as Title I. it has to be based on non-public schools wishing to participate. So that's those that said, yeah, I want to do this. And then they must have been open and operating prior to March 13th. So if a new non-public opened up this summer, they would not be eligible to participate. The student poverty data is typically used, and it's typically free and reduced lunch. Students that are counted towards the allocation are the same as those that are generating funds. So it has to be your low income kids and those that reside in a Title I eligible attendance area. I call that like a Title I neighborhood. My school where my kids attend and the neighborhood that I live in, if they go to that public school and get Title I services, well, then they would be eligible to generate funding for the non-public school they go to. Again, it's 2019-20 data. Now here is a visual of how it all works out. The spreadsheet that we provided is a breakdown for all of the non-public schools in a particular district and across district lines based on the worksheet G data that districts provided for the 2020-21 school year, 19-20 data. So you take low-income kids in the non-public school, divide it by low-income kids that live in Title I neighborhoods, and then that is where you receive your proportional share. Okay, so let's say your district has already consulted, we've issued the proportionate share and spent some funds. What are we supposed to do now? Again, we need to review the new calculation of funds. In most circumstances, I think all districts except one, then equitable services is less money. We also need to have consultation, and you need to document that consultation. So calls, meetings, webinars, emails, that needs to be documented. And all expenses that were incurred and delivered between March 13th and September 25th will be honored. Now, it's important to know that non-public expenditures that exceed the amount that the district reserved for equitable services due to the implementation of the IFR, it's important that you document that and indicate the IFR is no longer valid. So let's say that a district had $50,000 of services under the old allocation, and now it's 10, but we bought $50,000 worth of fumigation services and face masks, and they're already used. On that expense, the district should note that it was using the old allocation based off of guidance and the IFR, recognizing that the IFR is now null and void. So how should we submit for expenses that were incurred between the 13th and the 25th? So to date, we have a handful of districts that submitted their reimbursement. And I've been working with our fiscal office and reviewing the requests that come in. They must have separate ledgers. We'll send them back to you if it doesn't have separate ledgers or if the ledgers don't have enough detail. So note to self, make sure that your non-public has a separate ledger than your public district, and make sure that it has ledger detail, that it's not just a lump sum summary. You could submit a request specific just for your equitable services. So let's say that you provided that fumigation and mask service for the non-public school back in July, that funding is spent, you could submit that with that appropriate documentation. Make sure to attach that ledger, and in some cases, I noticed some districts are providing receipts as well to show that timeline, consultation, and documentation. So because the formula that we have to use now uses Title I data, do we need to use services just for Title I kids or Title I teachers? The answer to that is no. CARES Act allows for all teachers and all kids to benefit from the money, but the formula is just based off of what was written in law that says it has to be the Title I formula. But again, consultation is critical. So having a conversation on who needs the services, why are the services needed, the allowable uses of CARES Act funds. CARES Act dollars are more broad than the regular title programs, but rules and regulations still apply. So you have to be mindful and do that consultation to make sure that the services are still allowable and the services still can fall under CARES Act. So I actually asked this question on a national webinar, and I'm like, can't we just keep it? Can't we just keep it all the same? And the answer to that is no. Unfortunately, there is no existing authority to allow a public district to provide equitable services when nothing is generated. So you can't provide equitable services when the dollar amount is zero. So if you did keep the information the same and you did not make adjustments to your budget or the services, this is where the public district and the non-public schools really do run the risk of paying back funds and not adhering to the allocation revisions after September 25th. Now, as I mentioned, the U.S. Department of Ed has said, okay, we'll provide an exception between March and September, but auditors, they're not going to be looking at CARES Act dollars until typically after the fact. It's more of an autopsy. So they look back in time typically. So these funds might not be audited until after implementation. So there's a couple things that you need to be mindful here. First, there is a clause that is called mitigating circumstances clause. And I have it here on the screen. And what it essentially says is it's protecting you and it's protecting the State Department. And it says that mitigating circumstances exist if it would be unjust to force the repayment of funds because the LEA violation was caused by erroneous written guidance from the USDE. So in other words, the USDE told us to implement it this way based on the guidance, based on their interim final rule. We can't be held against guidance that they gave to us that was then overturned by the court. So that's what this means. You will want to keep this or have whoever's working and provides documentation for your auditors, you will want to keep this regarding any purchases between March and September. And again, you need to document your communication in consultation with non-public schools. So this was a question that probably happened actually earlier this spring because the pandemic happened in March 13th, and we were aware that there was going to be some CARES Act funding available. We weren't sure those equitable services. And in some cases, like a non-public school might have fumigated their area or done they needed some type of service before the money was actually in the hands of the district. So the question is, can we reimburse a non-public school directly for purchases made between March and when the LEA got its application approved? So as you all know, the public school can never, ever, ever, ever pay the private school. You cannot write them a check. However, you can here. So between March 13th and when the district's application was approved, if there was a non-public expense, and let's say it was a COVID outbreak in a school, and so there was cleaning and fumigation services, the non-public school would have that. It would be documented with their contract and receipt for services. The public district could write them a check out of this CARES Act funding to reimburse them. It has to be between March 13th and then between then and consultation. It has to be documented with a contract, receipts, so forth. It has to be secular and allowable, and keeping in mind that the district must maintain and control. So let's look at if it was a contract for deep cleaning, you could reimburse that non-public school directly. Let's say that the non-public school needed laptops in order to do distance education with its kids. So, okay, yes, the public district could reimburse the public school if it happened after March 13th, but before the grant, all of those things. But keep in mind the equipment, title, and inventory has to be transferred to the public district. That is public school district property when implemented with the CARES Act funds, whether it be ESSER or GEAR. So public school district property. Expenses that occur after that consultation should have been part of the district application. And then the services, and let's say it was equipment purchases, then the district needs to purchase that equipment and tag it, inventory it, and so forth, and then provide that over to the non-public school for services. Okay, this was something that was new to me when we were on a federal call, so we did include it here. And it was, how long can the non-public equipment or supplies that were purchased with these funds, how long can they remain with the non-public school? And the answer is during the period that the ESSER funds for performance, they can remain there during that period. So which is the 2020-21 school year, and I believe we have them through June of 2022, or until the supplies are no longer needed for the purposes of the CARES Act program. So, or until the COVID is over, the pandemic is over. Once the equipment is no longer needed, the LEA can use the equipment locally in the LEA, or they can use it within the non-public school towards another federal program. So like for the Title I program. So if a non-public school purchases a significant amount of equipment, when the pandemic is over, that equipment will go back to the public school district, or it can stay in the non-public school and be utilized by the other federal programs and services that are implemented in that school. So this is a question that we are seeking more information on. Stephanie is actually approaching CCSSO with it, but in particular, if a non-public school generated an equitable share under the IFR and guidance formula, but now generates $0, what happens to some non-consumable items that were purchased, like equipment? So let's take that district that purchased, or let's say generated $50,000 under the old formula, and now we're looking at $0. If that $50,000 was used for equipment, the questions are, well, can it stay with the non-public school? Does it go back to the district? And we have, I think, conflicting information, and so we're getting further guidance on that question, because ultimately the equipment is property of the public school district. And the question is can equitable services be provided when $0 are generated under the new formula? Okay, it's time to unmute your mic or chat your questions, and I am going to put myself on screen, possibly, and answer questions that you might have. So I've seen a couple more come in through the chat. Let's see here. Who determines when the pandemic is over? I think that's a great question. I have no idea. I don't know. I don't know who determines when it's over. I don't know if when CARES Act is over, is that the end of the timeline? So I think that's a great question. Was North Dakota DPI any part of the lawsuits? We were not. To my knowledge, there were no non-publics or public schools that were part of the lawsuits, and DPI was not a part of the lawsuits. A question came in on what do we do about expenses incurred between September 26th and today? I think we need to discuss that maybe a little bit further, but ultimately on September 25th is when the allocation adjustments needed to be made. So if there were expenses, I think we would need to try to troubleshoot with the district on what to do with those expenses. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions happening right now in the chat. Does anybody want to be brave and unmute themselves and or raise your hand and I can unmute you and ask a question?
And this is Melanie. Catherine, I have a question about if a private school has now an allocation of 0, but they have spent money on devices, purchased, delivered, inventory. Do those devices need to be removed and brought back to the public school at this point?
That is a great question, and that is exactly the last question that I shared, but you asked it way better than we worded it, Melanie. So we are trying to find an answer for that. Here's what's conflicting in my gut. So Lori Matsky and Amanda Peterson, my colleagues, I kind of was saying, okay, I'm not going to go into this because I don't know the answer, but I'm going to share with you. I'm going to bring you into my circle of anxiety. It's something that I've learned. I can share with you. So what I know is, let's say the allocation stayed the same. That equipment, that inventory, that is public school district inventory, no matter what. Now the question is, when the allocation is 0, can the district just still provide that equipment because they don't want to interrupt services to the kids? I don't know. What trumps? Does the service delivery to the kids? Does the fact that we're providing services to an entity that no longer has the services? What is the timeline for that? That's kind of the questions that are circling in our head. And then the other thing is like, okay, this doesn't make sense for kids. The pandemic didn't discriminate. So I still have some issues just even with that. We are reaching out to our partners. There's some legal firms that interpret a lot of these laws and regulations and help us bring it down to a level we can understand. I can understand, I should say. So we'll update you when we know more about that. But to answer your question directly, Melanie, I don't know. Don't do anything today. Don't go to the school today and take away those laptops. We will let you know more when we know more.
Maybe then a further clarification just to make sure I understand it correctly. But regardless of the allocation, if devices were purchased at the end of whatever this time frame is, June of 2022 or the end of the pandemic, those devices will need to be returned to the public school.
Correct. So that existed prior to any of this. Any devices, any equipment, any like non-consumable items is property of the public school district. So at the end of the pandemic, whenever that is, or at the end of these funds, those come back to the public school district. Now, there are scenarios with other funding pots that we're like, okay, if the non-public wanted to buy them for, current negotiated value, other things that you can do. But yes, that is public school district property, and it can be used back in the public school, or let's say that 5 laptops were purchased, and by golly, the Title I program could use those 5 laptops in the non-public school. Then you could use it for that type of a federal program. So I do see Scott, I agree. Scott had said we need to know these answers sooner rather than later. So as soon as you have it, I will say yes, I agree to that. I appreciate you all taking time in this webinar to kind of go through some of this with us. And like I said, for me to invite you into my circle of anxiety and sweaty hands, because it is a complex process. As a non-public school with a new allotment, are we eligible to apply for GEAR funds through our local public school district? So Non-public schools cannot apply for GEER funds. They are for public school districts. I do not believe, again, it's operated out of the governor's office. You could check the CARES Act, but I believe it's for public school districts, public school special ed units, public school CTE centers, those type of things. Mary Beth Trainer, I see that you have a question. Do you want to unmute yourself? Mary Beth Trainer, I am looking to see if I can find you so I can unmute you, but I'm not seeing you.
I found her, Anne, but I'm not allowed to unmute her. So I think she's the only person that can unmute.
Okay. So Mary Beth, if you are on Teams, just choose the little microphone and unmute yourself. If you are on like calling in on a phone, I think you *6 or anyone else on the phone. In the meantime, anyone else have questions? I want to be mindful of your time here with us today. We have about 8 minutes, but I am happy to hang on the phone longer. I do see some districts that said, we need to schedule a one-on-one time. Just so you know, I will gladly do that. I'll probably invite other colleagues like Stephanie Tucrow, who's the state ombudsman, and her role is to help figure out non-public school equitable service issues. So she'll be in that.
Mary.
Yep, I see Mary Beth is trying to unmute. I can't unmute anybody either, unfortunately. I can mute you all. Any other questions? Mary Beth, if you're not able to put it in to the chat, you can always, of course, email me, and I'll gladly do my best to answer your questions. And that goes for anyone on this call. In the meantime, I'm going to share a few more resources with you. You should see my slide deck again. Okay, so here are some additional resources. So the ESSER funding website, and I navigated you to that already. That's on our COVID page, and then COVID funding and the ESSER funding. So there you're going to find the allocations, equitable services, some guidance. These FAQs as well as other FAQs will be posted there. ND web grants. So this, if you have the PDF, you should be able to link to this, but this is the website where you'll submit your claims, so your request for funds, quarterly reports. Non-publics don't do this for these ESSER funds, but the public districts do. And then the U.S. Department of Ed has quite a bit of information on their website as well. They have their equitable service updates, their guidance, the letter from Secretary Devos, and so forth. And who can you contact with questions? So definitely you can reach out to myself. I'm Ann Ellefson. Stephanie Tucrow, as I mentioned, she's my colleague. And she's the state ombudsman for non-public schools. She and I work very closely together. If you have questions on web grants, you're a public district and you're like, how do I submit into this web grant system? Shauna Greff is a great contact to get a hold of. And if you have questions on those ESSER payments, what should be paid? What kind of ledger should I be uploading? Lisa Johnson is your go-to person there. So I did provide direct email addresses to all of us. Feel free to reach out to us and contact us if you have questions. And that is the end of my slide deck for today. A question that someone did ask was who was kind of all invited to this webinar and will the recording be sent out to all? The answer was I sent this to every public school district administrator that has non-public schools in them, and the non-public school administrators that I had contacts for. So sometimes there was a business manager, sometimes a principal or a superintendent, all received the email, all received an invite, all received the worksheets. And I would say our attendance today was pretty good, probably around 40 some people on and off throughout the day. But to answer your question, yes, non-publics were invited to this conversation. Okay, with that, somebody muted me. I want to thank you all for your time today. Thank you all for the services to the kids of North Dakota. We will keep you updated as we learn more. We're moving forward with the information that we have right now. If you need to schedule a one-on-one meeting with us or our team at DPI, please reach out to us in a chat message or an email message, and we'll gladly set something up just to have conversations. So with that said, I want to thank you all for your time, and I hope that you have a great evening. Thank you.